Easy up! Back on the streets! Took my time, took my chances! I run away! It happens too fast! I run away to survive! I am the tiger in the cemetery! And girl, there's in my rival! I run away of the tiger with the terror! And I finish fire of the tiger! Ha ha ha! Hoo ha ha ha!
Hello my dear friends, how have you been? Good, I hope. I'm Berserkir, and today I'm going to talk about the figure of the Berserkr, in plural Berserkir, and the figure of the Ulfhdinn, plural Ulfhednar. Supposedly two sorts of elite warriors from pre-Christian Scandinavia who wore bear skins and wolf pelts respectively, and consumed hallucinogenic substances to enter in a state of frenzy that led to trance to enhance their warrior qualities and ferocity in battle. Would it were so simple. So, this is the sort of video where I shall correct, revise, and even to a certain extent contradict my past works concerning the Berserkr and the Ulfhdinn figures. There's been a lot of work going on, not just from me, of course, obviously, but several others, loads of new resources and studies. So I'll try to keep all of my speech as updated as it has been possible so far concerning the study of the Berserkir and the Ulfhednar, or of the pre-Christian Scandinavia. I've already made a video about the symbology of the bear, both in Old Norse and Sami religious traditions, and in that video I have started to explore already the figure of the Berserkr precisely. There's a lot to say, and the hardest thing to do, I think, is knowing where to start. So I think I'm going to pick information from that video and start from there, and then develop the rest of this video. So stick around, there's a lot to say. I'll even talk about hallucinogenic substances and maybe teach you how to make a special ointment. I will also talk about psychological behavior concerning battle madness or frenzy, and the bibliography I've used to compose this work will be at the very end of this video. Also, just one quick note before we start, I won't take much of your time. As you know, with the help of my patrons, I have managed to buy a new camera, so without a doubt the image quality is way better now. Thank you very much, my dear friends, once again. But when you buy something new, something else will go to hell. I guess it's to create a balance or something. So my microphone simply stopped working and died. I bought a new one, which is this one right here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but right here by my side. So let's see if the sound quality is way better now too. You shall be the judge of that, of course. This one came with a dead cat. This is the name they give to it. I'm not making this up or trying to be funny or sadistic. It's just the name of this thing, a dead cat. I don't make the rules. Anyway, no need for this because it is to muffle the wind, so it will probably prove to be useful outside, if I ever get out of quarantine. Now, let's see how this goes and let's get started. The first thing that comes to mind concerning the Berserkir is that they were fierce warriors completely apart from the common warrior, dressed in the skins of bears, in the case of the Berserkir, of course, and in the case of the Ulfhdinn, a warrior dressed in wolf pelts. And at first sight, they seem to have been warrior elite making their presence among various Scandinavian leaders and chieftains, and even alongside kings, forming a kind of special bodyguard troop sometimes of professional warriors who acted in a state of intense frenzy, shouting, howling, growling and biting their shields, not only to intimidate the enemy, possibly, but to represent and incorporate fury to the point of acquiring extreme strength and courage and resistance to pain. This is what we often get the general picture we have of these figures. Perhaps we should start with precisely the idea of being a warrior elite. I've already explored on a video, which you can see right here, the initiations of warriors from an Indo-European past and related to the symbology of the wolf. There's no point in repeating myself, but, well, in general terms, in several mythologies, we seem to have a clear link between the dog and or the wolf, and a group of specific warriors who sacrificed these animals. And not only is this quite present in Indo-European traditions, but also in Indo-Iranian traditions. In the ancient Celtic, Lusitanian, Greek, Germanic, and Indo-Iranian traditions, young men often left their families to form warrior societies. These young men would often live on the boundaries between civilization or the civilized world and the wilds, the wilderness, who occasionally stole from other human beings and even killed, behaving just like wild dogs or wolves. Supposedly, it was part of their training. So these were the sort of elite warriors who were expelled from their social groups and told to raid other communities. For instance, in the Germanic traditions, these bands of young warriors thought of themselves as being wolf packs. There is indeed a famous myth about the hero Siegfried, who puts on a dog skin to go training with his nephew, whom he is training to become a warrior precisely. For instance, this is just one example. There's no point in repeating myself, like I said. The point here is that indeed we have several references to warrior initiations that either involve the dog or the wolf, and usually the initiation of the warrior to enter in such groups is indeed the killing of a dog. Usually, unfortunately, as you know, it was a puppy to take out the innocence of the young warrior, or in extreme cases, it was to hunt a wolf, a fierce wild animal. We also have these sort of initiations of the warrior in pre-Christian Scandinavia, mostly from half-mythical accounts. What we get from the sources is that indeed there is an important relationship between the warrior bands and the other world, the world of the spirits, the world of the dead, even a connection with the divine. Concerning the wolf rites and the symbology of the wolf connected to a kind of warrior elite, we immediately think about the Scandinavian Ulfhednar, wolf pelts, warriors dressed in wolf pelts, supposedly. So they seem to have held on to certain ritualistic traditions of the past from the Indo-Iranian and Indo-European wolf rites. Indeed, well, the truth is the Ulfhdinn are not specifically warriors who dress in wolf pelts and go to war like that, nor are they any elite warrior group. Both the Ulfhdinn and the Berserkir function as initiators into the warrior group, it seems. Ulfhdinn and Berserkir, wolfskins and bear shirts, respectively, are labels, or better still, nicknames. Both are alternatives, one and the same, but we shall get to the symbology of the animals. In the Viking Age, not everybody was a warrior, and it wasn't particularly entire social groups living in a warrior society. We see Vikings indeed as warriors, or Scandinavians in general in this period as warriors, due to the contact other Europeans had with the northern peoples from this period specifically, which was through Viking raids directly, witnessing firsthand these pirates at work. And so the knowledge people had of these people was that they were terrible and fierce warriors, so their society must have been quite terrible and filled with battle every day. So the earlier sources to pass on that image to us. But fortunately, thanks to archaeology and even written sources when studied carefully, we know perfectly well that most Scandinavians of the Viking period were farmers, artisans, fisherfolk, craftsmen, hunters, people who lived off the land. Viking raids were a necessity. It was an impulse provoked by a series of geographical realities and climate changes as well, and the sudden growth of the population, along with other social, political, and economic factors, of course, that led these people to seek out new and more lands to farm, and seek out riches elsewhere, and open new trading routes. They were farmers who were forced to raid to survive. Now, the normal thing was that men went on Viking expeditions for some years before they finally settled down as farmers and started families. We continuously see this in the sources and in archaeology as well. As soon as they managed to find a piece of land, the raids stopped. They were forced to seek out new land, new property, to survive, to farm, to start a family. It is a wrong assumption to assume that Viking raids were a question of religion and that they lived in some sort of religious society whose very gods demanded raids, demanded bloodbath, war, conflict. Viking raids were out of necessity. So, once Viking expeditions went on for some years, the Vikings would eventually settle down to farm and start a family. So in this case, the role of initiator is clear. Think about it. You were a farmer, a craftsman, a hunter, a blacksmith, a person of the common folk maybe, or lowborn, or even a son of a king, but your brothers are all ahead of you in the line of succession, and you need to find a living elsewhere, doing something else, and find your own riches, your own land, property, your own wealth, your personal wealth. Congratulations, the life of a Viking is for you. You have no other choice. You need to be initiated into a specific group that will take on a boat or a ship and go Viking, go pirating, raiding, expedition, trading, exploring, and so on. You are a new member within the group. You are initiating. You are the initiator, the new member of the warrior band. You are the Ulfhdinn or the Berserkr. Both are alternative nicknames for the initiator, the new member of the warrior group, and not the terms for all who were to go on a Viking expedition or a specific warrior elite. Now, this is one of the possible scenarios. We shall see further ahead other scenarios. But wait, why specifically the wolf or the bear? Well, we recall the ancient wolf rites, and the initiator in the warrior band had to pass through those wolf rites, and this tradition must indeed have been kept until quite late, probably still in use in the Bronze Age of Scandinavia, maybe even early Iron Age. And like all things and all traditions, it passes on to the stuff of legend. We have several accounts concerning shape-shifting into a wolf, or somewhat related to the change of appearance, shape and form to that of a wolf in the Old Norse sources, written sources. People knew these stories about the mythical wolf rites, wolf warriors, and gods associated with such things. And so, to the new member of the group that goes on into a Viking expedition, the nickname of wolf skin or wolf hide or pelt would be given, which may have to do with earlier sources concerning not specifically wolf warriors, but the stuff of legend, perhaps werewolves, which in turn in Old Norse sources seem to have been a phenomenon of oral tradition and later a literary phenomenon to explain certain psychological behaviors. And in order to explain those behaviors, people were equated to the behavior of the animals that mostly resembled the psychological imbalance present in such people. I shall get to this further ahead, don't worry. We are just getting started. This is the introduction, and it shall make sense as I go, don't worry. As I said, we see a strong connection between the warrior band and the other world. Behind the action of going on a Viking raid, there were eventually several religious and mythological ideas attached to this act to provoke a sense of pride or give courage, or rather to encourage and to push people into going on a Viking raid. No matter what we do in life, the religious mind always tried to find a divine reason, an higher reason or purpose, or tries to find an explanation in the religious sphere for any action, any tradition. So obviously, the lifestyle of a Viking, to a lifestyle of a Viking, certain religious ideas were linked to give an impulse and to encourage young Scandinavians into go on Viking. We have the case of Valhalla, for instance, which in the late Viking period it starts to change from an afterlife place for specific warriors belonging to the nobility only, or a hole of for the dead, for warrior kings, chieftains, leaders, and other people of high rank and linked to a warrior culture, and then changes to a place for warriors in general, and then for the chosen ones of Odin, for the Einherjar. Valhalla becomes the place to encourage people into going to battle without fear, because a warrior's death would lead the person into Valhalla and become a chosen warrior of Odin. Such a privilege, such an honor, a legacy to become the stuff of legend. Valhalla and the prospect of becoming an Einherjar was to encourage people into going to battle, to motivate them into going into raids and start killing each other. What young boy would not want to be remembered forever as a great warrior and feast among the gods in a seat of privilege in a hall filled with drink, women, and everlasting battle? The Ulfhdinn and the Berserkr are alternative names for the same initiator of the warrior group, the new member, and these initiators were the human counterparts of the Einherjar, the dead warriors taken into Valhalla. Ulfhdinn and Berserkr were the nicknames given to the new members of the group who would go into a Viking expedition to encourage them precisely to and giving to them that sense that they were the human counterpart of the mythical Einherjar, the dead warriors chosen specifically by Odin, the bravest of the brave. Because indeed, there is no doubt that both the Ulfhednar and the Berserkir, being one and the same, quite possibly, they are all linked to Odin, which gives us the belief that there was a special kind of warrior group dedicated to Odin, and they belonged to the cult of Odin. Odin wasn't a god originally from Scandinavia, as you know, but his cult was brought into Scandinavia during the migration period, already during the Iron Age. His cult was exclusively of the elite, of nobility, among nobility. The common folk cared little about Odin, since they were farmers and prayed to the gods of fertility, which is why in Scandinavia there are more place names derived from Vanir gods and other fertility deities than all the other gods combined. The cult of Odin becomes quite famous and progressively gains religious ground precisely during the Viking Age, when this god of the elite was finally introduced to the rest of the population, especially to common warriors, because members of the nobility, jarls, hersar, chieftains, even possibly kings, started to lead their own Viking raids and expeditions, and their god, Odin, was brought to the people they needed to make a successful expedition. This is the moment when Odin becomes the major god of the warrior class and linked to the figure of the Ulfhdinn and or the Berserkr, the initiators into the group of Vikings. Like I said, Odin wasn't originally from Scandinavia, but in fact from continental Europe, a god of death, battle frenzy specifically, which was introduced in Scandinavia by the ruling elites of the old Germans, old continental Germans, and as such it remained a cult within nobility, the god of nobility. We have references that wolves had once been sacrificed to Odin, hanged on trees, and we also have references of continental Germanic warriors dressed as wolves. So perhaps the survival of the tradition of the wolf rites linked to warriors from an Indo-European past and Indo-Iranian past as well. We shall see that as well further ahead. So, having been an Ulfhdinn or Berserkr, or in other words, having been initiated into a warrior band, means that the person from that moment on began to have a special relationship with Odin as well, which again implies that the person after death would become one of the Heineriar, the other worldly counterpart of the Ulfhednar and the Berserkir. Without a doubt, Odin was attached to the warrior bands, as it had been in continental Germanic traditions. Not particularly the god of the warriors, or a warrior god, but the god of the kings, chieftains, leaders in general of the warrior bands. And the relationship between the warrior and his leader, or chieftain, automatically links both of them together and to Odin. Both the old continental Germans and the Scandinavian warriors, with this religious attachment to Wotan or Odin, respectively, from the religious point of view, they were characterized by a kind of ecstasy which was the result of their consecration to Odin. Obviously, according to the sources and the religious worldviews of these societies during this specific period. So let's take a few notes about that. And I am aware that I haven't explained yet the bear connection to these warriors, but in fact I already have in the other video about the symbology of the bear, which, if you remember, it's more of a Sami religious spiritual thing. While the wolf as a religious symbol is an Indo-European tradition surviving in continental Germanic societies and eventually brought into Scandinavia, the bear in Scandinavia as a religious symbol was much more prominent among the Sami and seems to gain more ground among Old Norse people precisely by the cultural exchanges between Old Norse people and the Sami. And if you remember in that video, it's precisely the spiritual involvement of the bear among the Sami that led to several tales and legends and myths about men shapeshifting into bears, becoming bears. And it's those legends and folklore that enter in the Old Norse society. And the shamanic aspects to a certain extent concerning the bear, which in turn are transported to the figure of the Berserkr. Again, I remind you, both the Ulfhednar and the Berserkir are alternative names, or seem to be, for the exact same, and are a mixture between the warrior wolf rites of Indo-European and Indo-Iranian past brought into Scandinavia during the migration period via the continental German migrations, with the shamanic religious symbology around the bear, which, again, to a certain extent, both are fused together due to some shamanic perceptions and the consumption of a substance that leads to ecstasy, and ecstasy leads to a trance state, and in that trance state one becomes the animal. We shall see this in a moment. Like I said, this was the introduction. I'm just giving you a few notions still to prepare you for what's to come. As I was saying, Odin is without a doubt of great importance and attached to warrior bands. He was primarily a god of death linked to the otherworldly army of the dead, an army of dead warriors who in death served Odin. This same concept arrived in Scandinavia and gave rise to the idea of the Heinerjar, the dead warriors of Odin, most likely beginning as an actual army of the dead, and progressively it became a concept more romanticized and just the bravest of the brave, precisely to encourage young warriors into going to battle and die in the battlefield, so in death they could be recognized as the bravest of the brave. So, as said before, the Heinerjar are the other worldly counterpart of the Berserkir and the Ulfhdinn. Therefore, Odin is attached to the very concept of these two figures. Odin was the god of ecstasy, connected to an altered state of the mind, frenzy, battle frenzy. It seems that indeed there were certain warrior groups in continental Germanic territories that formed distinct social groups, and from the religious point of view, these groups were characterized by a kind of ecstasy which was the result of their consecration to Odin. On this case, on the god that in Scandinavia would later on become known as Odin. And this ecstasy caused such warriors to function or to act better than a regular warrior, to enhance their warrior skills and prowess in battle. And as such, acting in such a way without fear in their hearts and show their bravery and skill, this after death would surely secure a place in the other world, in Valhalla, alongside Odin and the other great legendary heroes and warriors of old, the Einherjar. As I said, the sources we have about Berserkir aren't many, and about Ulfhednar are even fewer, and they are either semi-mythical or downright mythical accounts. Of course, some scattered information here and there as well, which, of course, may be dubious at the very least. However, in terms of this ecstasy and supposedly the links to an intoxicating substance consumed to act in this frantic way, we may be in the presence of some elements of initiation into the warrior band, such as age restrictions. In some sources concerning the Old Norse society was somewhere between 12 and 18 years of age, or undergo a trial as the killing of a specific animal, or a wolf maybe, or even a bear. A trial of strength, as is shown in Hrolf's saga, the requirement of having to lift a especially large stone from the ground and to show a certain measure of courage and strength. These tests of courage and strength were included in warrior initiations concerning various aspects of the life of a warrior. And these same tests of strength made the person welcomed in the group of warriors, provided that, of course, the person passed the tests, the trials. So this may be the reason why it is often said that the Berserkir, the bear shirts, had an immense strength, an inhuman strength and a great resistance and resilience and courage, not because of supernatural powers or the drinking or consumption in any way of substance, but because they were the ones to pass the trials, the tests. Therefore, they were considered better than the ones that obviously didn't pass the tests or didn't pass the trials. This also makes me think, of course, that perhaps indeed the Berserkir and the Ulfhednar may not have been, after all, alternative names for the initiator, but in fact two distinct positions. The Ulfhednar may have been the actual initiators, the new members of the warrior groups, therefore considered wolves, which on an Indo-European past, in some cultures, may have been considered dogs, in relation of being pups. wolf cubs, new members, young members. And the Berserkir, on the other hand, were perhaps the older members, veterans if you like, those who had long passed their trials and tests and were seasoned warriors and no longer pups, no longer wolf cubs. There is one single source that mentions precisely both the Berserkir and the Ulfhednar as being two separate and distinct groups, a source probably written in the early 10th century. But at the same time, that source is filled with elements that are too exaggerated and dubious. I'll put it here for you to read. So we are not clear if these two groups were indeed different from one another, but if they were different, the explanation might be in the idea that one are initiators and the others are the veterans. In this particular account, the Berserkir are described as drinking blood, and there is a clear separation between the Ulfhednar, who are said to carry spears. The fact that the Ulfhednar carry spears indicates that there was some discipline among them, and they fought in battle formations, and they had a specific role to play in battle. Now it's curious that we have more sources about the Berserkir, but nothing in detail is described about them, and fewer sources on Ulfhednar, but we have more details about them. And it seems they were specifically part of an army, which might indicate indeed that they were initiators, in need of discipline, in need of coordination, and a specific role to play in battle, while the Berserkir, on the other hand, may have been veterans, not giving a rat's ass about battle formations, therefore considered crazy, out of their minds, biting their shields, going naked into battle. Or the fact that Berserkir did not specifically make part of the army, but went with the army, but acted on their own, might mean they were mercenaries, which we shall see further ahead. Sorry. But it's curious if we look at the actual social behavior of the bear and the wolf, the actual animals. The bear tends to be a solitary animal, while wolves live in packs. So this may be the most obvious reason why warriors in group were considered to be Ulfhednar, wolf pelts, wolf skins, and solitary warriors considered Berserkir, bear skins or bear shirts. But a Berserkr may not actually be a warrior dressed in the skin of a bear, which honestly would be quite limiting in terms of movement while in battle, and may actually be a reference to being naked, which we shall see. We will also see that further ahead. But I almost forgot about the intoxicating substance or hallucinogenic substance. What can we say about it, if there was any? Let's see. If we follow this line of thought that at least the Ulfhednar were the new members, perhaps after their trial, their initiation, they would consume something, possibly a drink, not only in commemoration, but a partaking in the ritual and being welcomed in their new brotherhood. Everyone that has been in the army knows perfectly well that among soldiers it's not just duty, it's not just a profession, following orders, making friends, but a brotherhood is created between warriors, between soldiers. And it may have been possible a sort of drink to settle the strong bonds of brotherhood, to affirm that now they belong to the same group. However, we must not forget about the sources that tell us about ancient warrior groups in many different societies of the past, and the idea of the consumption of something to enhance one's abilities in battle. There's always an example I like to give, which I find fascinating, which are the Halmavarka. In one of the oldest references that mention the Syrians, there is a particular branch of Syrians that were called Halmavarka, which mean the wolves of Alma. specific Scythians living in a strong warrior culture, labeled as wolves, and the particularly interesting aspect here is that they were the wolves of Halma, and Halma being an Indo-Iranian word to describe Amanita muscaria, the famous mushroom. Now, this is just one example of many warrior societies linked to an intoxicating consumable with hallucinogenic substances. In several sources, which I may put a note here from different civilizations and cultures, there is often the mention of an intoxicating substance that leads to an altered state of the mind. Many scholars throughout the years have long debated the botanical identification of this particular substance, mostly reaching the conclusion that it may have been a psychoactive mushroom, Amanita muscaria. We know that both in Siberia and Sapmi, the land of the Sami, in certain shamanic rituals, Amanita muscaria is consumed, but not directly, but rather letting reindeer consume the mushroom, and then through the animal's urine, the shaman consumes the substance, the properties, the animal serving as a natural living filter to safely consume the properties of the mushroom in question. So this could actually be the intoxicating drink. Now, could this be the substance consumed by the Scandinavian Berserkir? We also have the plant cannabis. Now, returning to the Scythians, we have references that after they had buried their dead, they had a ritual to purify themselves, throwing the seeds of cannabis to hot stones. And the smokes and the fumes provoked by the seeds of cannabis are very dense, very thick. It's a very strong smell. And this was a way to purify themselves, clean themselves, cleanse themselves without the use of water, but from the vapors. This was done in a sweat lodge, much like more or less the concept of a sauna. And all these vapors from cannabis seeds have been interpreted as a likely substance to induce an altered state of the mind, which has been known to be a product in certain shamanic ceremonies, indeed, and rituals as well, as an instance of the shamanic psychopomp function. Could it be cannabis that was used as a substance to induce an altered state of consciousness by the part of the Berserkir warriors? I don't believe so, and here's why. Cannabis seeds are hard to find in the archaeological record, as you might imagine, but not impossible. Cannabis seeds have been found in contexts of the Osberg ship burial, for instance, whose material culture transports us to the world of Seidr. And indeed, the person buried there not only clearly had a great importance among that specific community, but she also seems to have had considerable connection with the other world and shamanic practices, or certain aspects within shamanism, but not fully shamanism. The likely scenario here, judging by the elements that indicate the practice of Seidr or any other such magical spiritual performances, is that she may have been a vulva, a prophetess, a seeress, and cannabis may have helped to induce an altered state of consciousness for the work of divination. Perhaps something similar to the Scythian sweat lodge spoken before, and the burning of the cannabis seeds to inhale the vapors. But this is a specific case for a prophetess, a seeress, and not a warrior. If you have ever done some sort of fighting in your life, you know perfectly well that in order to perform correctly and not get your ass kicked, your mind cannot be altered in any way. Even a drop of alcohol is enough to dull your senses and make your movements slow and your reflections slower. A warrior completely out of his mind would just make a fool of himself in battle and get easily killed in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, he would fall before the battle even began and be trampled to death. And not the sort of action that gives you a ticket to Valhalla, is it? Cannabis was not the likely substance consumed by the Berserker warrior. Berserkr. There has been some discussion about the use of cannabis among the Old Norse peoples, especially during the Viking Age, that the Scandinavians during this period were avid consumers of cannabis, as we find a lot of evidences of plantations of hemp and hemp in many burials and other archaeological contexts of the Viking Age. But I must remind you that the Viking period marks precisely a great increase in the industry of ship building, boat building. In fact, in the case of Norway, as you know, so many trees were cut down during this period exactly to make ships and boats and all sorts of water transportations that the sea level rose during the Viking period. What did Viking ships needed? Ropes, loads of ropes. Ropes were made of hemp, which is why we find a great abundance of hemp in Scandinavian archaeology in Viking Age context. Not to mention that you can make all sorts of clothing out of hemp and baskets and other containers. Recently there has been a study, only the gods know who makes these studies, and it was often shared in the past few months all over the social media, that Vikings used hallucinogenic tea to become violent. The Berserkir supposedly drank hallucinogenic tea to get violent. Many warriors took advantage of the drug's effects to improve their performance in battle, to enter in a state of euphoria, as we are often led to believe indeed concerning the Berserkir. That's what we often hear, that the Berserkir were especially violent, and that it is precisely where the English word berserker comes from, and that they were immune to fire and pain, and supposedly this new research reveals that Vikings used hallucinogenic tea before battles to carry out their attacks with hyper aggressiveness and with less sensitivity against physical attacks. Supposedly the tea was made from the plant commonly known as henbane, black henbane or stinking nightshade. The use of this plant in battle, in conflict, supposedly would have reduced the sensation of pain and would make the warrior a wild thing, unpredictable and highly aggressive, which in fact the Berserkir in the sources are characterized as being unpredictable indeed, but that may be because of other reasons we shall see further ahead. Now, henbane or stinking nightshade and its hallucinogenic effects immediately makes me think about Antropa belladonna, or commonly known as deadly nightshade. If we take a look at the written records left by the Bavarian court physician named Johannes Hertlieb, he describes to us a formula used by the Nordic witches of the 15th century, a formula to create an ointment with hallucinogenic properties that induces an altered state of consciousness, and one of the plants is Antropa belladonna, deadly nightshade as it is commonly known, very similar to the stinking nightshade supposedly used in a tea by the Berserkir. The problem with these plants is that you do not directly consume them. You do not insert them in your mouth and let your organism dissolve them, unless you want to die, of course, because they are highly poisonous. This is why ointments were created out of this plant. and you do not consume it directly. You either put it in your chest and inhale the vapors, or you put it in your skin under your armpits and let your skin absorb it. And the hallucinogenic substances will act, and there are fewer risks of getting poisoned. There is a third way to do it, which I'm not going to talk about in here, not today, but it's precisely the reason why witches are characterized or portrayed as sitting on a broom. Perhaps you take my meaning. Anyway, consuming a tea with this substance would be certain death in the best case scenario, so we can assume that the plant perhaps was heated and only the vapors inhaled. It is true that this plant, stinking nightshade, has been used as an intoxicating substance in many European cultures, so it is reasonable to perhaps assume that the Vikings also knew what they could do with it and found ways to use it. But when it comes to ethnobotany, or indeed in the archaeological context and the use of plants and the few evidences we have from the Viking garden, well, indeed, we do not have enough evidences. Regarding herbal medicine in the Viking Age, in truth, there are very little recorded evidences concerning plants used as medicinals during the Viking Age, the Viking period. The first herbals and other medical texts were not produced in Scandinavia until the 13th and the 14th centuries, and all of them show a very clear influence from continental European beliefs and practices about medicine, rather than actual something really focused on Scandinavian culture. Herbalism and healing, particularly the four humors theories of the medical school of Salerno, Italy, ultimately based on the works of the Greek physician Galen, as you know, and on the Arabic medicine from Avicenna. During the medieval period, medicine was greatly advanced in Italy and in the Islamic world. As I said, the written works about herbs in Scandinavia start only to appear at the end of the 13th century, and those are the works of Christians without a single trace of religious beliefs in a pagan background. But of course, without a doubt, individual physicians and healers in the Viking Age from Scandinavia knew of herbal remedies, surely. One herb used extensively in Scandinavia, both in cooking and also prized for its medicinal qualities, was thorn, Angelica officinalis or Angelica archangelica, commonly known as garden angelica or precisely Norwegian angelica. And we find it in archaeology on a more Viking garden context. But we have to be careful, especially careful, when we claim to know of the use of hallucinogens among the Vikings and among any one of the ancient world for that matter. And making claims that Viking warriors used these plants in battle is even more dangerous, of course. Henbane, or stinking nightshade, grew in many vegetable gardens and gardens in general in the Viking era, and it was used to relieve excruciating pain and even difficult births. However, it was rare and expensive at the time, hard to grow, hard to come by, so it was used in a very moderate way, not to be used for trivial reasons. So it seems unlikely that warriors would just use this plant for altered states of the mind to achieve battle frenzy. They must have been wealthy warriors indeed to possess such a plant. Now, today, it is possible to see the plant in reconstructed or reconstituted gardens such as in Leir, in Denmark, and Trelleborg in Sweden, and there are several warnings about the plant, including visitors, tourists, that they are not allowed to touch it. After all, it is highly poisonous. So those who indeed possessed this plant, and used it for medicine purposes, handled it with care. give the plant to a warrior, and he dies even before having consumed it, just by the touch of it. Sure, we can take the previous example I've given you of the 15th century witch's ointment with several plants, so maybe they could carry into battle that ointment or something similar, but I find that highly unlikely as well, and besides we have no evidences of that in the archaeological record. So we do need to be careful with such statements. The active ingredient of this specific plant is used in modern medicine as anesthetics, as a substance that induces insensitivity to pain indeed, but just think about it. If Berserkir really used a tea made of this plant, the effect would be devastating, because in addition to hallucinations and lack of sensibility, it would cause vomiting, diarrhea, and horrible rash. Can you imagine a fierce Viking warrior going into battle with diarrhea and vomiting and scratching, or passing out completely in a soup of his own body fluids? Not a pretty sight. This is also why I mentioned precisely the Amanita muscaria, the mushroom. It is the same problem, serious side effects. The only possible use was to filter it through urine, as it takes away, in part, the side effects. To this day in archaeology and, well, Scandinavian archaeology, as far as I know, no traces of hallucinogenic plants have been found in burials of warriors. The only case are the cannabis seeds, linked to a possible cirrus, and that parallel with the Scythian custom of purification by the burning of cannabis seeds. As I had pointed out before in videos concerning the economy of Scandinavia during the Viking period, among the Norse, the Old Norse people, fur from bears was an important and costly export good. In the Old Norse sagas, the bear is often viewed as material to be explored, consumed, traded, exploited, rather than an actual sacred entity. There was no particular religious importance on the figure of the bear among the Old Norse of the Viking Age, and it wasn't seen as an animal propitiator of some supernatural qualities. The bear was mostly, in great part, an important animistic religious symbol among the Sami, and unlike the Old Norse people, the Sami heavily consumed bear meat. As I said, fur from bears was a costly product, and there are evidences of the trading of bear fur between the Old Norse people and the Sami, and the fur was a costly export good, mostly sold in or to other medieval cultures outside Scandinavia, mostly England. So I doubt that the Berserkir, supposedly warriors in bear furs, would actually dress themselves in bear furs, because it was too costly a product for the common warrior, and even if they were warriors from nobility, they would hardly be on the actual battlefield and get the costly product ruined by conflict. As I said, the bear was a very important religious symbol among the Sami. So could the Berserkir have been in fact Sami mercenaries fighting for specific lords and kings? This would explain why they are solitary and why they are considered to be warriors apart from the main army, outsiders. But I also find that highly unlikely, because between Sami and Old Norse people there were many conflicts. They didn't simply hang out, and there was a lot of racism from the part of the Old Norse people towards the Sami and towards the Finns as well. They simply didn't get along that well, or at all, except in the borders where there was a strong cultural syncretism. But then again, a mercenary doesn't need to get along with others, as long as the mercenary is being well paid. The figure of the Berserkr that we find in the Sagas is quite the stereotypical unscrupulous person or animal, unpredictable, dangerous, and sexually ravenous. As a matter of fact, the Berserkr is characterized as being a wild person. In fact, that's exactly what they were in a way, because the Berserkir in plural, were seen as people outside society, too unpredictable and dangerous to rely on. As said before on other videos, the Berserkir follow somewhat the same pattern as the Vargar, which means wolves. A man who was a killer and performed the killing in stealth was considered a murderer, and thus was referred to as Mordvargar, literally a killer wolf. And thus, the penalty for the crime was to outlaw the person, banish the person into the wild places of the world beyond the pale of the law. So anyone could kill these people on sight, hunt them down, because they were no longer seen as human. They did not belong to a community, to the civilized world even. They were wolves, animals, beasts. So do pay close attention at this point. As a matter of fact, in early medieval legal concepts in Scandinavia, the term Berserkir was used to express outlaws. As I've said, a murderer, particularly a person that killed someone and did not declare in public the deed, and so try to do it in stealth and get away with it, was called a Mordvargar, killer wolf. If indeed we return to that idea that both the term Berserkr and Ulfhdinn are variations of the same, we could be in the presence of criminals, outlaws, and the wolf skins can be compared to the Mordvargar, killer wolves, because they were no longer seen as humans but as wolves. So, metaphorically speaking, they wore the skin of the wolf as in they became the wolf. And as we have also seen in certain early medieval legal concepts, the term Berserkr and plural Berserkir were used to describe precisely outlaws. As I said, the saga accounts of the Berserkir are greatly stereotyped. Even the accounts that specifically focus on one single character as being a Berserkr, the character himself is greatly stereotyped as well. A Berserker plays somewhat the same role as a Mordvargar, indeed, as a killer wolf. He is an outsider, unpredictable, and very dangerous. In Egil's saga, Egil kills a servant when the Berserker rage descends on him, and he nearly kills his own son too. So it's a dangerous person and unpredictable. Egil's grandfather is called Kveldwulf, meaning evening wolf, and he is best known for his foul temper, his rage, his sudden change of moods. But here's the thing, we know more about the Berserkir than we know about the figure of the Ulfhdinn, the Ulfhednar, and the latter seem to be just another type of Berserkir, either Berserkir warriors or who dressed with wolf hides, or we are in the presence of warrior criminals, murderers, Berserkir criminals and murderers, outlaws, hence the reason why they were so named Ulfhdinn, wolf hides, wolf skins, because they were considered to be wolves, Vargar, Mordvargar, killer wolves. Yes, I said before that we have more detail on the warrior gear of the Ulfhednar. They carried spears, and they were in an army sometimes, it seems. But we do have more sources on the Berserkir, but not their battle gear, however. We do have a lot more on the psychological behavior of the Berserkir, and the sources seem to contradict themselves, as I have said, in relation to the Berserkir. But that is natural, I think, as most sources were where the Berserkir are included are quite late in the Old Norse culture. Most of the sources, not all of them, but in great part concerning the Berserkir, are from the later Middle Ages, the very late Viking period. Now, reinforcing that idea that Berserkir might have been mercenaries, hence the reasons why they are also seen as unpredictable. In one version, the Berserkir appear as bodyguards of kings, or often in groups of small units containing a specific number of troops, usually 12, which is an odd number. Other versions, they fight in the vanguard of an army, or in the prows of ships, so they seem to usually be small numbers, private troops a king can use sometimes, and they are placed in the head of an army, in the front of the conflict. Now, this may indeed mean that they were hired mercenaries, or the reason why they are put on the front line is precisely so they can be the first to die, and not hired mercenaries after all, but criminals, whose specific penalty for their crimes is to fight for a lord or a king and be in the front of the conflict. And who knows, maybe being pardoned if they survive and do their duty. Now, in Old Norse literature, the Berserker is seen as someone actually bad, and you don't find in the sources people boasting that they are Berserkr, simply because it was something quite negative in the Old Norse society. Again, we have the case of Egil's grandfather, who is described as a Berserker, judging by the psychological aspects comparable to the same psychological behavior of other Berserker accounts. And he is named Kveldhulfr, evening wolf, comparing him to the figure of the Ulfhednar. And this character, when his mood is changing and becomes unpredictable, he moves away to avoid contact with other people, to avoid being seen acting as a Berserkr or Ulfhdinn. In the Old Norse sources, when someone is called a Berserkr, that person or character is often not a good person. In Old Norse written sources, the Berserkr were not at all popular within the Norse society, and in fact it's quite clear they were seen as evil people, dangerous, unreliable, outlaws. We usually link the Berserkr to the figure of the bear and the Ulfhdinn to the wolf. Perhaps the translation was taken too literally. Therefore, they are seen as warriors who covered themselves with fur, either in bear's fur or wolf's fur, which led to the assumption that they were warriors in some sort of tribal cult of these animals, or to these animals. However, there is a problem in relation to the Berserkr simply because of the suffix ber, which doesn't just designate the word bear, the actual animal, but also bare as in naked, in the sense of absence of clothing, or sometimes more often absence of armor, protection. Because it was initially thought that the Berserkir were warriors dressed in the fur of or hides of bears, that same line of thought was automatically transported to the Ulfhednar as well, wolf skins. Bear it with me. The Berserker means bare of skin, not particularly naked, but more likely without the use of armor, as the Old Norse serkr means shirt, and it may well be referring to shirt of mail without protection. This created parallels with the fact that Berserkir were placed in the vanguard, in the front of a battle, without protection, criminals who are supposed to die indeed. Imagine living in a Viking period and being a warrior with the idea that you had to die in battle to enter Valhalla. If you are a criminal, a murderer in a Viking Age society, you would have been outlawed, and you could be killed on sight, hunted down. Now, would you rather be hunted down like an animal, Or since you have a sentence of death upon you, would you prefer to die as a warrior, a second chance, and die in the battlefield to enter Valhalla? Or let's say to have some dignity and purpose in your death. So Berserkir warriors, warriors without armor, the front soldiers meant to die. And this transports us to the Ulfhednar, not particularly in the sense of wearing actual wolf furs, but in the metaphorical sense of being criminals, murderers, Mordefire, killer wolves. And so they take the skin of the wolf, they become the wolf. They are labeled wolves, as the animal term for a criminal. In one particular account, the Ulfhednar are said to carry spears, as I've said before, and be in the army. So it could be criminals indeed who have committed a lesser crime, maybe, perhaps not a murder, but something else not grave enough, not serious enough to be a Berserkr, a condemned warrior, perhaps. So, turning to the Berserkr, we start to work with two hypotheses. The first, in which this suffix, ber, perhaps has a much older origin, and that can be referred to the animal indeed, or that it simply has another meaning, referred to naked, the absence of protection. The latter is more likely. The Ulfhdinn, Ulfhednar, or the other, on the other hand, can be safely translated as the skins of wolves or wolf skins or hides. The etymological differences are in the characterization of the Berserkr as the warrior who perhaps fights without protection, or another hypothesis is to fight using a bear skin. So the Ulfhednar are actually just Berserkir covered with wolf skins, when they are not either using protection or a bear skin. Or the likely scenario, a Berserkr, if he was a mercenary, becomes an Ulfhdinn when he becomes a criminal, when his uncontrollable and untrustworthy behavior leads him to become a murderer. And the person wasn't actually wearing a wolf skin, but was so named as a form of adjective, a literary stylistic device referring to something indirectly, a kinning. So it's quite possible that in times of war it wasn't a case of calling upon an elite group of warriors and some sort of allies or mercenaries, but it's possible that certain political powers, lords, chieftains, possibly even kings, called upon criminals and very dangerous people and incorporated them into their own army as a form of pardon for their crimes, maybe, or simply because it was cheaper to have such warriors, and the aim is to have a number of soldiers easy to get rid of, use them as tools in battles to reach victory, and yet if they die, nothing is truly lost, as they were criminals and their penalty was death anyway. So better just give them some usefulness. So the portrayal of these people as wild beasts isn't actually praise, which led to the belief they were fierce warriors, but it may actually be negative criticism, defamation, denigration, portraying these people as wild animals, taking away their humanity, as they are no longer welcomed in the civilized society. It could very well be negative criticism on the point of view of the civilized society of the Old Norse peoples, because they did not call Berserkir as actual warriors. They called them precisely Berserkir, bear skins, bear shirts, either with the animal hides or naked. And this nakedness might not just be without protection or without clothing, but naked as in without that which makes someone a civilized human being. As members within an army, they are a means to an end, a useful evil. They were not seen as citizens, not seen as warriors, but as bears, beasts, like the outlaws called Vargar, wolves, murderers and criminals, Ulfhednar, Berserkir, labeled wolves and bears respectively due to their criminal behavior. Now, this is a possible interpretation based on the sources where we clearly read that Berserkir and Ulfhednar were not seen as something positive. The positiveness reflected in these figures is actually a modern interpretation, and we still have that one case of shape-shifting, the change of appearance, the change of hamre to become bears or wolves, these Berserkir and Ulfhednar. I've made a video solely for that, for the concept of shape-shifting and the concept of hamre, which you can see right here, and please do watch that, because I'm sure you will understand this idea of shape-shifting related to the Berserkir and the Ulfhednar, as shape-shifting in general seems to have been description in the Old Norse written sources to express a psychological imbalance. And this psychological imbalance is often perceived in the figure of the Berserkir as being unreliable, untrustworthy, violent behavior. So on top of all of that has been said until now, the shapeshifting character expressed in the figure of the Berserkr may well indeed be a form to explain psychological imbalance of a person, becoming the animal, becoming wild. Do watch that video, seriously. Otherwise we shall be here on this video for at least 2 hours, and I doubt anyone can take that much from me. On that video I also speak about the shamanic connections in the idea of shape-shifting, and you will better understand this psychological imbalance I'm speaking of. In fact, if you have survived this far, a few more minutes won't hurt. I may yet speak about certain aspects of psychological imbalance which may reflect this battle frenzy and battle rage and battle madness often related to Odin, as he bestows that gift to warriors. But I will focus particularly on the battle frenzy and madness related to Berserkir for now. I think it's also important to mention how the Berserkir were seen in Icelandic sagas to understand some of the characteristics applied to them, which, with the course of time, start to be the stuff of fantasy or legend, or somewhat turned into monsters coming to disrupt the peace. Now, in Icelandic written sources, the Berserkir are usually described as warriors who fought madly in battle, in such a way that they felt no pain and they did not need armor. The sagas present them in various ways, as warriors who are a special part of the armies of King Harald, blessed by the god Odin, or as dangerous outlaws who enter Iceland in search of land and women for their warrior band. Now, quite often identified with the figure of the wolf and the bear. In general, the Berserkir in Icelandic sagas are almost always characterized as warriors who appear during the festivities of the end of the year, for some reason, to steal women and duel with the settlers in order to get their land. In Gretti's saga, Jarl Eirik's discomfort with the number of Berserkir who had gone to Iceland in order to loot this territory is quite clear. However, he forbids legal duels, and I'll put a note down here concerning that precisely, and he also seeks the support of Icelandic leaders so that he could restrain the actions of the Berserkir raiders and invaders. This representation of the Berserkir in the Icelandic sagas as warrior figures who normally come from outside Icelandic territory, Norway and or Sweden, appearing at the end of the year festivities to take women away and lands, obviously raises the question around the very characterization of the Berserkir. To what extent or how far goes the religious intervention in the characterization of the Berserkir in Scandinavian sagas of the Christian period? It is not uncommon Berserkir appearing in Icelandic sagas. In fact, a great portion of written material we have about Berserkir, and Ulfhdnar as well, are from Iceland after the Catholic period. And Berserkir seem to appear during the Yule festivity, which, as you know, is an especially religious Christian celebration brought into the north, because Yule wasn't actually celebrated in pre-Christian Scandinavia, not in December anyway, but I shall explore that on a future video. Calm down, don't crucify me just yet. But that's another clue. The Yule celebration of December in Scandinavia appears with Christianization and the implementation of the Christian religious calendar. So, Berserkir appearing in a Christian festivity or celebration to duel men and steal away their women, and they howl and bite their shields and walk on hot coals, does give us some understanding why Berserkir in general were characterized as violent beasts. Furthermore, Berserkir are often related to the bear, the animal, which was an animal greatly demonized by the church actually. And in some Icelandic sagas, the Berserkir are defeated by some element linked to the Catholic faith, overcome thanks to the wiles of some bishop or the power of the cross, a blessing of a sword. And since steel cannot kill the Berserkir, some element containing the blessings of the Catholic faith weakens the Berserkir, and then they are killed with clubs, beaten to death. So you see the amount of religious fantasy around this, and they are almost always portrayed as foreigner demons in the Icelandic sagas. Of course, I cannot end this video without speaking a little bit about certain cultural factors of continental Germanic territories before the migration period, before certain cultural aspects reached Scandinavia, but also the case of animal furs and the battle frenzy or battle madness aspects. We know that the Germanic peoples of continental Europe have had a long tradition of associating certain warrior groups to specific animals. And we have depictions of Germanic warriors dressed in bear and wolf's furs. In the Trajan's Column, for instance, as you know, a Roman monument of the 2nd century. Certain Germanic tribes indeed had a strong association with the wolf and the bear, more noticeable in personal names and the names for tribes related to the wolf, actually, and the bear. And bear warriors also appear on several occasions in antiquity. We have sources concerning the activities of the Rus in the East, for instance, describing these people as going into battle and fighting with an incredible frenzied madness, and these Rus warriors made terrible sounds, roaring like animals and howling, and they attacked with a blind rage, completely discarding their own safety. Precisely and exactly how Berserkir warriors are described in Old Norse sources. All in all, the descriptions point to complete madness and insanity. And interesting enough, among the Rus from the same sources, which I have probably placed on a note right here, it is also described that there were warrior women among them, several actually. So this is just yet another source to add to the couple of videos I've already done about female warriors. Anyway, this was just a side note, doesn't matter for now. From Scandinavia itself, in archaeological terms, we find a great number of depictions of warriors wearing skins or pelts or animal hides as early as the 5th century, precisely around the migration period. And I think one of the best examples is this one right here, I'll put somewhere in here, of a 7th century helmet plate, where we see a man with spears, often interpreted as being Odin, alongside a warrior dressed in a wolf skin, wolf pelt, maybe a Ulfhdinn. One good example also is the golden horns of Gaius. These golden horns you see right here were found in southern Jutland in Denmark, as you know, dating to the early 5th century, the very end of the Germanic Bronze Age and beginning of the Germanic Iron Age. Now, the golden horns of Gaius depict a couple of figures which seem to be engaging in dancing and perhaps even acrobatics, which might indicate dancing performances in specific celebrations or rituals. But we also seem to have masked warriors in here, or masked figures with weapons. We see human figures in several positions alongside snakes. These have been deduced to be dancing positions, although the likely scenario here is that each human figure represents a letter, possibly, or a phrase, but most likely an idea. Not actually dancing positions, but they represent ideas, and together they give us indications of a coherent story. But we have representations of sword dancers, and this is a better indication of ritualistic dancing or ceremonial performances using some sort of dance while handling swords. There are also depictions here of two masked figures armed with swords and shield on the smaller horn, which are reminiscent of other Germanic depictions of sword dancers or sword dances. We have written sources about at least 3 annual festivals that were known and celebrated throughout Viking Age Scandinavia. Of course, the examples I've shown in here, they are not from the Viking Age, but we are trying to draw some parallels here, right? We do have evidences that masks were used in Scandinavia, from archaeological remains found at Hedeby, for instance, although the ones you see right here are sheep masks. But it's very possible that such masks have been used in annual celebrations and were part of a costume worn by dancers performing during a ritual or sacrifice, or even performing throughout the ceremony. So, during the Viking Age, there may have been indeed ritualistic dancing and connected to wearing the furs of animals. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine in the 10th century referred in his book of ceremonies to a Gothic dance performed by members of his Varangian Guard, who took part on a dance while wearing animal skins and masks. These Goths, by the explanations we have, seem to have been Scandinavians, actually, because we know that the actual Goths, were not actually present in Byzantium at this time, at this period, the last of them having left in the 6th century. So in the 10th century, the imperial bodyguard was composed of Rus, or Varangians. So the text would therefore seem to describe the customs of Scandinavians. It has been suggested that this type of costumed dance may also be seen in figures from Swedish helmet plates, scabbard ornaments, and bracteates, which depict human figures with the heads of bears or wolves dressed in animal skins, but having human hands and feet. These figures often carry spears or swords and are depicted as running or dancing. These were possible performances in ceremonies connected with these people's worship. Perhaps devotees or priests, most likely cult leaders, taking part in seasonal rites, carrying these items precisely in order to link themselves with the deities of battle and fertility. There are depictions of Scandinavians as Goths performing a sort of battle custom where plays in honor of the gods were enacted after a victory, in which they resembled womanish movements of the body. It is described as such in the Latin written sources. And the clatter of players on the stage and the tinkling of little bells or the clashing of bronze cymbals. Saxo Grammaticus, in his History of the Danes, also refers to certain womanish gestures performed by cult leaders and devotees in the cult of Freyr at Old Uppsala, for instance. Now, if we go back to the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age of the Germanic cultural world, gold amulets from the 5th and the 6th century have been found, showing more images of dancing and people leaping and dancing figurines and dancers in horned helmets. Horned helmets, as you know, were not actually used in combat but precisely in ceremonies. So these dancing figurines, often shown naked or wearing only a belt, are featured in many helmet plates, including the Sutton Hoo helmet, 7th century of the Common Era, Anglo-Saxon. You can see the Sutton Hoo replica right here, and a similar detail from the helmet plate from Torslunda, Sweden, and a bracteate fragment from the Gudenstein. We clearly see these dancing performances here, and dressing in animal skins, as is also described by the Greeks precisely during the Viking period. So the actual custom of wearing animal skins and weaponry does seem to have been used in ceremonies, in dancing performances, in ritual, but not actually in battle. Most likely ritual performances in worship of warrior deities before and after a battle, not just to celebrate victory and also defeat, but also to mourn the dead, as we have described in the same source I have previously spoken. The Byzantines hear the Rus warriors mourning their dead, and it is described as a very strange high-pitched howling, which was terrifying for the Greek soldiers. Now, we still have the case of battle frenzy, mass violence, and uncontrollable violent behavior in the figures of the Berserkir and the Ulfhdnar. This battle frenzy, battle madness, which has been connected to the consumption of an hallucinogenic substance, might actually be simpler than that, and directly related to the study of psychological dimensions of conflict. We have several sources throughout history speaking of this battle rage aspect in warriors, a collective frenzy that alters the perception of reality due to an imbalance of the psychological self provoked by a terrible ordeal. I've spoken about this in the shape-shifting video in shamanic terms, but now I'm going to talk about in terms of conflict and battle and war in general. This battle frenzy, battle madness, battle rage might indeed be actual madness. Remember that the Germanic god Woden, Wotan, which would later on in Scandinavia be known as Odin, was the main god and possibly the only god related to battle madness, battle frenzy, which is the symptom provoked under special conditions of the most extreme stress. This battle madness is caused not only by fear, but the extreme stress provoked by conflict itself. by the shocking violence, the sounds all around of weapons and screams of fear, screams of the dying, the bloodbath, the shouts of commands, all the madness that leads a person to completely lose it and enter in a state of extreme rage, extreme violence, extreme stress, often running aimlessly forward with completely disregard for one's own safety, being extremely unreliable, extremely violent and unpredictable, and scream, entering in a state of complete hysteria, and the warrior enters in a red madness, which we often read in descriptions as being such a stressful environment that soldiers are seen shouting and laughing hysterically while they fight. If you have been in such stressful conditions, thank the gods if you haven't, but if you have, you know exactly precisely what this battle frenzy is. And it is indeed complete madness in all the sense of the word, a temporary disorder, imbalance of the psychological self, which is why we also get these descriptions of the Berserkir, that they were unreliable, unpredictable, untrustworthy, running aimlessly, screaming, shouting, roaring, howling, hysterical, hyper-violent. Maybe it's not just a question of being mercenaries or criminals, but actually the description of warriors who completely lose it in the extreme stressful environment of a battlefield. Listen, we have descriptions that after the Berserkir went on a battle madness, they would spend days sleeping, recovering, which was assumed that they were resting or recovering from the effects of some drugs. No, I don't think so. Unfortunately, such claims are often from people who have neither taken drugs nor have they fortunately been in a horrible battlefield. These several days that Berserkir took to rest, which we have explanations that they were extremely tired after the battle, this is called shell shock and battle fatigue, which are post-traumatic stress disorders. For all of those who have not experienced such a thing, honestly, may all the known and the unknown gods keep you away from such a thing, a terrible thing. Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. This was a big video, but I hope you have enjoyed it and that it contained useful information. Please share it, give it a like, subscribe, and so on and so forth. Once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. By the end of this video, I will have the bibliography for you, don't forget, if you want to continue the studies of this theme. And as always, tack för idag.